You feel the marble cold beneath your feet. Torchlight flickers against gilded walls. Somewhere in the corridors above, a woman is laughing high, wild, unafraid. You don't know it yet, but that laughter will outlive empires. Before we go deeper, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Honestly, it amazes me that a scandal from 2,000 years ago still reaches people across every continent. Now, let's step into the palace, where Rome learned that power doesn't always wear armor. Rome, 48 CE, the Senate still convened beneath marble gods. The legions still marched in perfect formation from Britannia to Syria. Citizens still believed their empire invincible, eternal, blessed by Jupiter himself. But inside the Palatine Palace, something had gone profoundly wrong. Not the kind of wrong that announces itself with blood or fire. The quiet kind, the rot that spreads behind closed doors until the entire structure collapses from within. Her name was Valeria Messalina. She became empress at 15, married to a man 30 years her senior, Claudius, the stammering scholar whom nobody expected to rule. The marriage was political insurance, a young womb, to secure the dynasty after Caligula's madness had nearly torn Rome apart. Priests blessed the union. Senators applauded. The people celebrated in the streets, grateful for stability, for the promise of legitimate heirs, for the restoration of dignity to a throne still stained with blood. History would remember her very differently, because within a decade, this girl bride would construct an empire of shame so elaborate, so methodical, that Rome's most powerful men, generals who'd conquered nations, senators who'd commanded legions, would find themselves trapped not by swords, but by secrets. She discovered what tyrants before her had missed, that you don't need armies to control people. You only need to know what they're afraid of. The question that haunted Rome then, and echoes still, is this: was she a monster, or was she the only woman in that world who refused to pretend? At first, she played the role perfectly. She bore Claudius 2 children, a son, Britannicus, and a daughter, Octavia, quickly, efficiently. Fulfilling her primary duty as imperial wife, she appeared at state ceremonies draped in modest stola, her golden hair arranged in the traditional 6 braids that symbolized virtue. She sponsored temple restorations. She attended sacrifices with appropriate solemnity. By every visible measure, she embodied the Roman ideal of matrona, the chaste, obedient, dignified wife. But the Suburra district, Rome's labyrinth of tenements and brothels, began whispering stories that didn't match the official portrait. Soldiers drinking cheap wine in dark taverns spoke of an aristocratic woman who appeared in the lupanaria, the she-wolf dens, where prostitutes worked. Not as a customer, as a worker herself. She hid her face beneath theatrical makeup, crude and deliberate. Obscuring the features that appeared on coins across the empire, she took money. She competed with professional courtesans. She gave no special treatment, demanded no recognition, and according to those who claimed to recognize her, she stayed later than anyone else, working until dawn while other women collapsed from exhaustion. The rumors were so outrageous that most dismissed them as slander, the kind of vicious gossip that always swirls around powerful women, except they kept coming, from too many sources with too much specificity. Servants whispered, guards looked away when asked direct questions, and Messalina herself seemed to radiate a kind of defiant energy that suggested the stories. However impossible might contain something true, this wasn't desperation. She had everything: beauty, wealth, power, access to any pleasure the ancient world could offer. So why would an empress, draped in silk and gold by day, strip herself bare in Rome's filthiest quarters by night? Some historians argue insatiable lust. Others point to rebellion against her forced marriage, a reclaiming of bodily autonomy in the only way available to her. But there's a third possibility, colder and more disturbing, that she discovered something intoxicating in the contrast itself. The more Rome demanded her purity, the more thrilling it became to violate it. The gap between empress and prostitute created a kind of psychological electricity that ordinary pleasure could never match. She was living 2 lives in absolute opposition, and the danger of exposure, the constant risk that someone would recognize her and destroy everything, became more addictive than any physical sensation. By the mid-40s CE, Messalina's private chambers had become something unprecedented in imperial history. Not a court, not even a den of vice in the traditional sense. What she created was more systematic, more calculated, a machine designed to manufacture shame and convert it into leverage. The banquets she hosted weren't celebrations. They were theater, grotesque, suffocating theater where Rome's social order was deliberately inverted. Senators arrived expecting honor and found themselves in scenarios they couldn't escape. Generals discovered their secret lovers seated across from their wives. Aristocratic families watched their daughters summoned under pretenses they couldn't refuse, returning days later with haunted eyes that wouldn't meet their father's gazes. She had loyal attendants, freedmen, and women who owed everything to her, recording everything, every whispered confession, every act performed under coercion or intoxication or the desperate hope that compliance might earn mercy. She built an intelligence network not of spies in foreign capitals, but of witnesses in bedrooms, and she understood something that Rome's previous emperors had not, that blackmail is more powerful than execution. Dead men can become martyrs. Humiliated men simply obey. Governors were appointed not for military skill, but for vulnerability to exposure. Generals remained loyal not through patriotism, but through terror of what she knew. Senators made decisions based not on Rome's interests, but on protecting themselves from scandal. The entire machinery of imperial administration was being quietly corrupted, its gears clogged with fear and shame. Foreign ambassadors noticed something strange during their visits. Men who should have been sharp and engaged seemed distracted, subdued, almost broken. Negotiations that should have been straightforward became inexplicably complicated. Rome's leadership was being consumed from within by one woman's hunger for control, expressed through the only power she'd been taught women could wield. The most infamous story from this period, recorded by Pliny the Elder and confirmed by Tacitus, involves a contest that still seems impossible to millennia later. Messalina challenged a celebrated prostitute named Scylla to an endurance competition, not metaphorical, literal. The two women would see who could service more men in a single night. Scylla was a professional, famous across the capital for her stamina. She paced herself through the evening, methodical and experienced. By dawn, she had serviced 25 men. Exhausted, she yielded, assuming the contest finished. Messalina didn't stop. She continued past 30, then 40. Ancient sources claim she only stopped when there were no more volunteers, when literally every man present had been exhausted. She had won not just a contest, but proven something darker, that an empress could exceed even the professionals, that there was no limit to her, that she existed in a category beyond normal human boundaries. The nobles who witnessed it sat in silence. This wasn't scandal anymore. This was something they had no language for, a violation so complete that it shattered every framework Rome used to understand power, gender, and authority. And Messalina knew it. She had turned degradation into dominance. She had made her own violation of social norms into proof of her supremacy. In Rome's rigid moral universe, where a woman's value rested entirely on chastity and obedience, she had found a way to weaponize their own rules against them. By being so excessively, impossibly transgressive, she became untouchable. Who would dare accuse an empress of behavior so outrageous that merely describing it would implicate the accuser in the same moral collapse? But power maintained through fear alone is inherently unstable, and Messalina's paranoia grew with her influence. She began seeing threats everywhere. Guards were doubled. Punishments for minor infractions became brutal. Her spectacles grew more elaborate, as if escalating the degradation could somehow strangle rebellion before it formed. In the military barracks, soldiers, men hardened by campaigns in Germania and Britannia, men who'd watched comrades die in battle, began muttering about the empress. Not just disapproval, open contempt. For warriors, death was acceptable, expected. But humiliation, the rumors that some of their own had been summoned to Messalina's villa and stripped of dignity before rivals, that was worse than any battlefield wound. A soldier who survived one of these summons later told a friend, in words preserved by chance in a private letter, blood dries, shame never does. He'd faced Germanic tribes in hand-to-hand combat, but what he'd been forced to endure in the empress's chambers haunted him more deeply than any scar. The whispers spread, loyalty frayed. The foundation Messalina had built on secrets and blackmail began showing cracks. She could feel it, even if she couldn't admit it. The system was becoming unstable, and like an addict unable to stop, she responded not by pulling back, but by escalating further. The breaking point arrived while Claudius was away in Ostia, overseeing grain shipments, mundane imperial business. In his absence, Messalina did something so reckless, so incomprehensibly bold, that historians still debate whether she'd gone mad or was attempting a calculated coup. She married another man, not secretly, not symbolically. A full legal Roman marriage, complete with priests, witnesses, signed contracts, and ceremonial rituals. She married Gaius Silius, a young senator who'd been her lover. In broad daylight, with members of the Senate watching, the auspices were taken, the gods were invoked. Every legal formality that made a marriage legitimate under Roman law was observed. She was now married to Silius, while still holding the title Empress of Rome, and wife to Emperor Claudius. This wasn't adultery, it was open rebellion, treason dressed in wedding garlands. She had crossed from shadow into daylight, her scandal transformed into direct challenge to imperial authority. What possessed her? Did she believe Claudius too weak to respond? Did she think her network of blackmail so comprehensive that no one would dare move against her? Or had the addiction to transgression finally consumed her completely, driving her past the point where survival instincts functioned? Had she become so intoxicated by violating boundaries that she could no longer recognize the difference between risk and suicide? Whatever the reason, it was the moment when everything collapsed. Loyal freedmen men who served Claudius directly, who owed nothing to Messalina, ran to Ostia with the news. The emperor laughed at first. Surely it was wild rumor, impossible exaggeration. Even Messalina couldn't be that reckless. But the witnesses kept coming. Documents were produced, contracts bearing official seals, testimony from priests who'd performed the ceremony. The evidence became undeniable. Claudius returned to Rome with soldiers. Not in a rage, ancient sources describe him as eerily calm, moving with the deliberate certainty of a man who'd finally seen clearly after years of willful blindness. The scholar emperor, so often mocked for his physical disabilities and academic distraction, became suddenly, terrifyingly decisive. Messalina was found in the gardens of Lucullus, the estate where she'd hosted so many of her infamous gatherings. Ancient writers describe her final moments with clinical precision. She begged for mercy. She offered her children as hostages. When no appeal moved him, she reached for a dagger to take her own life, the honorable Roman death, but her hands shook. She couldn't complete the act. A soldier stepped forward and finished it for her. The empress who'd enslaved Rome through shame died, begging and afraid, discovering in her last seconds that the power she'd wielded so absolutely could vanish in a heartbeat. All her schemes, all her intelligence networks, all the secrets she'd collected, none of it could save her when the emperor finally decided she had to die. Claudius ordered immediate damnatio memoria, damnation of memory. Her statues were toppled, faces chiseled off inscriptions, her name scraped from every public record that could be altered. It was Rome's worst punishment, reserved for those who threatened the state's very foundations. The goal was erasure, to make it as if she'd never existed. But Rome never forgot. The more they tried to bury her, the louder her legend grew. Writers recorded her deeds in vivid, horrified detail. Mothers warned daughters about her fate. Senators used her name as shorthand for moral collapse. She became the standard against which all future imperial excess would be measured. Stand in the Palatine ruins today and you'll see tourists photographing mosaics, marveling at engineering that's endured 2,000 years. But underneath, something darker persists. The stones remember the villa hidden in plain sight, the marriages that were coerced, the blackmail that entangled Rome's most powerful families, the wedding that challenged an emperor. Messalina's legacy isn't just scandal, it's a warning carved across centuries. Empires don't only fall to external enemies, they collapse from corruption that ferments within their own walls. She proved that shame could bind men tighter than chains, that sexual humiliation could be weaponized into political control, that the most dangerous person in Rome wasn't the general with legions, but the woman who knew what everyone was desperate to hide. There's a question her story poses that remains, unanswered across the millennia. What happens when the person chosen to embody virtue crowns herself with vice, when the vessel meant to preserve moral order becomes the agent of its destruction? Messalina never commanded armies. She never wrote laws. She never governed provinces. Yet she nearly brought the greatest empire in history to its knees, not through force, but through the deliberate, systematic exploitation of shame. She understood something fundamental about power that Rome's military-minded rulers had missed. That civilization rests on a foundation more fragile than steel. That the line between order and chaos can be crossed by a single person with enough audacity and enough hunger for transgression. The palace still stands in ruins on the Palatine Hill. Tourists walk where she walked. The sun sets over stones that witnessed her rise and fall. But somewhere in that silence, in that weight of ancient sunlight, her shadow lingers. The empress who ruled through degradation, the woman who discovered that the greatest empires don't only crumble under siege, sometimes they rot from within, poisoned by the very people meant to preserve them. Her laughter still echoes in those corridors, wild, unafraid, impossible to silence. A sound that refuses to die, even after 2,000 years of trying to erase it.